Hi YouTubers, this is another video from your friendly neighborhood reviewer, Evelyn. Today we're going to be reviewing the new AMC show, wait for it, Interview with a Vampire. I did the reaction to the trailer, if you see the thumbnail here. And let me tell you before we start off, I've read all the books, almost all the books from Anne Rice. The first book I read while in high school, when going to the library, was Interview with a Vampire. I read that book and it just left me entranced with the whole mythology of vampires, the romanticism, and the, homoerotic undertones that it had within the book. I even saw the film with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. But stylistically, the film was, 60% portrayal of accuracy, but plot-wise, they left out quite a lot of things, especially the ending, as a lot of people who's read the book knows that Daniel Malloy, who was not in the film, was played by Christian Slater. He goes back to the ruins of what Louis described, and he gets turned by Armand, the character that Antonio Banderas played, even though Armand was meant to be like the appearance of a 16-year-old boy. So forgive me if I get things a bit muddled up, because it's been 15 years plus since I've read all the books. Well, I read most of the books, so I still remember the basic gist of it and a lot of elements. Now, before we get into the series, I read some time ago that Anne Rice said, I think it was in an interview, that Interview with a Vampire was meant to be like a prototype for a gay couple with a daughter. And let me tell you something, this series did justice what the film couldn't, because we had to think of different time settings and where we are now. A lot of people are going to refer back to the film, which they shouldn't do that. It's completely separate timepiece whatsoever. So let's start off. Episode 1, we get introduced to Daniel Malloy. The big question when we saw the trailer was, why is Daniel looking so old? I assumed that maybe he would be an amalgam of David Talbot from the Talamasca. Could be, I know that they've greenlighted for a season 2, so that should tell you that it's done really good. So we see how Daniel Malloy's life is. He has to adapt to the new world, and then the series does touch on the pandemic, which I was like, okay, a little bit strange, but hey, what's stranger, the pandemic or vampires? And we see that Daniel Malloy is adjusting to this new technological age, in which he has to promote himself online, doing these cheesy videos about his skills as a journalist. And we also find out that he's suffering from Parkinson's. So while talking to his daughter about the pandemic and stuff, he receives a mysterious package with some tapes, and he reads it, and it's from Louis de Pont-du-Lac. When we see in the letter in the whole old handwriting, and then when we see the cassette tapes, it was yeared, I think 1973. So we start to understand that the film has a shifted time period in which Daniel Malloy had his first encounter from the book in 1973. So he reads the letter from Louis and says that he wants to meet up again with Daniel in the place of his choosing, in which we find out it's in the Emirates, the United Emirates in Saudi Arabia. When I saw the, classic kind of architecture from Saudi Arabia, I was like, that's it. And the other part is that Daniel has, balls of steel of going to a known predator, even though he could have chalked it up to having him hallucinations, because we found out that when he had the first interview with Louis, he was mostly high on drugs, so he can barely remember most of what he was talking about. And so they come face to face and meet again. Well, Daniel is clearly disgruntled about the situation. I don't know if he's clearly suicidal or something, but he antagonizes Louis, and he tells Louis what am I doing here? I lied to people saying that I'm meeting the most dangerous person in the world. And clearly Louis amused at Daniel being, so off the cuff, aggressive, and Louis tells Daniel, I know you're suffering from Parkinson's. So the idea of episode 1 is re-establishing the relationship between Daniel and Louis and the connection back into the past. So they start off with Louis recounting how in around 1910 in New Orleans, he became the owner of his father's company that used to grow sugar, but now he turned it into a brothel. And he's the man of the house, and his younger or older brother Paul, there's something wrong with him mentally. He's obsessed with religion. Of course, Louis' profession is not that clean, but considering the timepiece and of course the racial discrimination between people of color, that's the only thing left towards that certain era of New Orleans. Now, before people jump and say, why did they change Louis from this, from this ethnicity to another? For people who haven't read the books, I'm going to refer to the film. Let's think about it. We're living in 2022. If we look at it plainly, do we want to see, two white guys, battling against each other? As in the book, Louis talks about how he lost his wife and childbirth to, I think it was cholera, but people correct me in certain areas of the story. And he was basically suicidal. Okay, Sam, you don't really feel that much empathy. Like, this guy had all the power of the world of an owner of a plantation, so what's to say, oh boo-hoo, he's now a vampire? As we're with this version of Louis the Pont du Lac, he's dealing with a multitude of things. He's hidden homosexuality, he's, dealing in, the dark stuff, racial discrimination, dealing with a mentally ill brother, and the mother that clearly has favorites, and he has to be there looking after his younger sister. So when Louis meets Lestat in this high-class brothel where they're fighting over this particular lady of the night called Lily. But that's when the attraction starts. But the attraction started for Lestat when he saw Louis about to stab his own brother because he was disrupting the business. Well, he wasn't going to really stab him, but threatening him. And then we can see that's when when Lestat, the predator, comes in. That iconic shot on the back that we see, I'm going to put a picture here of Lestat. So iconic. The actor portraying Lestat de Lioncourt is Sam Reid, and the actor portraying Louis de Pont du Lac is Jacob Anderson. And let me tell you, the certain, tonal shift in both people. Tom Cruise, great actor. He did embody the childishness, the arrogance of Lestat, but it was too Americanized. With Sam Reid, the kind of accent that he has is kind of like you can't pinpoint anywhere. Is he French? Is he Russian? Is he German? And as well with his, features. So at first, Louis and Lestat have an antagonistic, well, they still gotta have an antagonistic relationship, but what seals them together is when Louis goes into a poker card game with all the white people from the quarter and Lestat is there. Lestat is hearing how all the other white gentlemen are disrespecting Louis, so that's when we see the supernatural effect. Lestat talks to Louis telepathically and basically is like telling him he doesn't get why everybody's treating him horrible, how they disrespect him, and in that moment we see that Lestat has held everybody in a hypnotism kind of way, and we see the eyes change color, and then afterwards when Louis sees what Lestat has done and he has no idea what to explain it, that's when kind of attraction starts, and both of them start chatting away about their lives, about their aspirations, and they start getting more closer together. Of course, like anybody, Louis wants to know what Lestat is because of the telepathy, mind control. And which within episode 1 and 2, they do cut off into present time, 2022, doing the interview where Daniel's asking pressing questions as to equivalating the experiences that Louis had and asking Louis how did he not know that Lestat wasn't a vampire. So he was like, well, in New Orleans, it's more of a nightlife, so nobody really questioned anything. So they never really questioned anything, so Louis was not really, pushing that point across. So the main crescendo of episode 1 is when Louis invites Lestat for a family dinner in his house, and his brother is there. And the brother is asking Lestat, very pressing questions about religion and faith, and asks Lestat whether he's close to God. And Lestat just blows his top and basically tells bits from I know with the Vampire Lestat, the second book was the Interview with the Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned. Vampire Lestat, the book was his autobiography, because Lestat became a vampire by not Marius, but this other guy, Magnus, I think. People correct me, it's been such a long time. So, and of course, I knew that Lestat originally wanted to become a priest longer in time, maybe early 1700s. So we get those little Easter eggs about Lestat's life. And while Lestat is there like fighting verbally against Louis' brother, we see that hypnotism telepathy going on, and Louis not having it, so he tells Lestat to stop him. So while both of them leave the place and Louis is there drinking, becoming drunk, and then we have a very highly intense scene where I'm not going to describe it for the purposes of YouTube, but the people that have seen the episode, you know what I'm talking about. Lestat invites Louis there, there's the woman of the night, Lily, and then Louis succumbs to his carnal pleasures, and Lestat and Louis have a full-on intimate scene that involves levitation and some flashing parts. And in that moment, it's where the intimacy comes fully together. But then again, Louis doesn't want to accept it. He vows to never see Lestat again. Of course, Lestat is waiting in kind. And then the younger sister of Louis gets married. They're having a nice time. The brother is somewhat normal, Paul, the one who's obsessed about religion. And after the end of the party, there's the sunrise. So both brothers decide to go up to the roof of the house to see the sunrise. But unbeknownst to Louis, Paul decides to take his own life by falling off the roof of the house. And then we have the gruesome aftermath. And then the mom of Louis, we can tell favorites here. She goes and blames Louis, saying that he must have said something to Paul to make him to fall to his demise, which is very cruel to blame your son that way. And of course, Louis is in despair. So while they're having the funeral, Lestat comes to try to console Louis, but Louis is having none of it. So whilst they're in the cemetery burying the brother, Louis can hear Lestat's calling in his head. He's like, "Come to me, Louis. Come to me, Louis." And when I saw that, I was like, whoa, this is like, I don't want to say grooving, but this is like enticing, seducing into the dark side. And Louis is just like out of his mind. He goes back to the church to tell the father that he must have confession, wants somebody to save his soul. And then Louis says in this prayer that he wants to, check out, if you know what I mean. In that moment while the priest is in the confession booth and Louis in the other, Lestat comes in and gobbles up the priest. And while Louis seeing all of this, he tries killing Lestat with the knife that he has in his cane. And of course we have the graphic scenes here. And then when Lestat sees another priest, there like trips on the blood. And then we have a graphic scene where Lestat goes and punches his hand through the priest's head. I'm not going to describe nothing more because I do want everybody to see this video. And that's when the point where Lestat seduces Louis even more and tells him, "I'm going to be there to free you of the shackles of society, and that I have a lot of love to give." And he tells Louis that, "I love you, Louis. Receive my love." And I'm like, whoa, this is so intense. And then Louis does reiterate to Daniel and someone in the present time and he says for the last time, well, not for the last time, that Lestat had a way with his words. And Louis ultimately agrees to be turned. So it's a painful process from what we see, like Louis' eyes change, or his senses change. One thing I do wish in that part that, okay, maybe I will refer a little bit to the film, in which we see that intense scene of Louis opening his eyes and seeing everything, more crystallized, the pictures moving. So that little bit, they could have did a bit more better on that. But apart from that, we see that Lestat is so happy having a companion. He basically told Louis in the transformation, "I want a companion." Because you have to admit, being a vampire is pretty lonely. So from end of episode 1 to 2, we see that Louis is trying to come to terms of being a vampire and everything that entails. We see at the end of episode 2 that Lestat and Louis are now together, and that they happen to buy off this building. The funny part of episode 2, I believe it was, that Louis went and killed this guy that disrespected him, but Lestat's rule, which is obvious, don't kill nobody important as to not to arise suspicion. And while the both of them are in their coffins, Lestat is like, "Oh, please don't be mad at me, like I can't sleep when you're mad," and he doesn't want to go to sleep that way. And he tells Louis, "What can I do to make you, be okay, forgive me?" And Louis tells Lestat, "Buy me, the biggest brothel house there is there, or club, whatever vernacular you would like to say." That bit's funny. We just see like the give and take here in the relationship, that Lestat wants to have Louis close to him no matter what. He may have his temper So with episode 2, it's like basically Louis coming to terms with how this being a vampire is affecting him and how he's not really adapting to killing people. And of course we have in episode 2 that he almost drains the blood of his sister's baby, but he doesn't do that. So that's episode 1 to 2. I've seen these episodes twice already and I've forgotten the end. It's an open-ended thing. So we have yet to be introduced to Claudia, also Armand. I don't know how they're going to end up in episode, how they're going to end, in the 8 episodes, but there's so much things that they can talk about to death. In Wikipedia, I saw before Anne Rice's demise, unfortunately. I think she was one of the executive producers. Also her son, Christopher Rice. This is how you do a retelling of a story for a new generation. If the story's good, it makes sense, people can take it. But if they just basically copy one story and change important elements without no reason, that's when things go wrong. This is a great telling of the story. These 2 actors are so, brave enough to put their whole entire being into these performances that you can believe. So let's give appreciation that we're going to have a season 2. I so want to know how they can end episode 8. They could do many seasons about the book and not finish the book yet. So anyway, we're at the end. This is the longest video ever because there's so much to explain. And if you reached the end, a big thank you. And if I leave you always, stay safe.